Tennessee flood insurance. What do you need to know as a homeowner in Tennessee? Well, that's exactly what we're talking about in this video. So we're gonna talk about 5 things you need to know as a Tennessee homeowner. So let's get started. But before we do, make sure to share, subscribe, and like the channel. Hi, I'm Chris, the flood insurance guru. More than 12 years ago, I bought a house in a flood zone just like this right here. I was given the wrong flood zone. I was given the wrong flood insurance premium. A lot of misinformation, and it had a big impact on my property value. It was going to send up my mortgage payment more than $300 a month. Imagine your mortgage payment going up $300 a month. Would have a big impact on you, wouldn't it? Well, my goal in this video is to help you minimize these impacts. So in this video today, we're talking about things like flood zones, flood risks and risk scores. And then we're gonna be talking about flood insurance options. We're going to be talking about flood insurance cost. And we're gonna be talking a little bit about flood insurance coverages in Tennessee. We even talk at the end about how much flood insurance do you need and is it mandatory in Tennessee? So let's talk about flood zones first and understanding Tennessee flood zones. Look, whether you live on the Cumberland River, the Tennessee River, if you're in Nashville, Knoxville, Memphis, Elizabethton, or even up in Johnson City, there's all different flood zones, but there's really 2 types of flood zones. We're talking about non-special flood hazard areas and special flood hazard areas first. Let's start with non-special. Now, these are areas that are going to be considered minimum risk by the federal government. These things will pop up as flood zone X, where typically flood insurance is not going to be required. Now be careful though, because remember almost 30% of flood claims in Tennessee still fall within flood zone X. Just ask victims of Hurricane Helene in Milton in North Carolina and Eastern Tennessee, where they were told they didn't need flood insurance, but they lost everything. So you want to remember that when we're talking about these non-special flood hazard areas. Now typically these non-special flood hazard areas sometimes have not been mapped by the federal government, or they're considered to be minimum risk, but the maps just haven't been updated. And we'll talk about the difference in just a second on that between that and flood risks in Tennessee. So those are non-special flood hazard areas. Then we've got special flood hazard areas in Tennessee. We're talking about things like flood zone A and AE. You know, these are areas that fall within that 100-year floodplain, you may have heard it called, or the 100-year flood zone. Remember, this is just the probability of a flood happening within an annual period. Could you have more than 100-year flood in a year? Absolutely. Could you have more than 1,000-year event? Yes. They're strictly probabilities. In fact, we see it common in some areas that have 200 or 300-year floods within a given year. You know, in North Carolina and Tennessee, of course, you could almost call it a 10,000-year event. Nobody's calling it that. You know, generally, typically they stick to the 1,000-year event that it's so rare. Could it happen again? Absolutely. And so that's what non-special flood hazard area is. Now, when we're talking about flood zone A and AE, if you have a mortgage in these areas, typically flood insurance is going to be required. But it really comes down to if you have a mortgage. Now, maybe you've taken out disaster assistance in the past, or you're dealing with the people in Eastern Tennessee right now that are going to take out disaster assistance or a disaster loan, but they didn't have a mortgage. They may still be required to carry flood insurance now by taking on that loan or taking on that disaster assistance. That's something you want to remember. Let's talk a little bit now though about the difference between flood zone A and AE. We've talked about how flood insurance is required on either one of these. One big difference though is the base flood elevation. Like you can see here right behind me with the water coming up to the land. That's what we could call the base flood elevation. This is the level that FEMA thinks flooding could come to. In most situations, one has not been determined for flood zone A in Tennessee, but it has with AE. Now, there's a lot of different things here. When you're at that level, if you're building a new house in Tennessee and you build above it, then potentially you could change your flood zone through a letter of map amendment process in Tennessee. However, if one hasn't been determined, it's very hard to do that. It's also very hard to determine some of the flood risks using these things. And we'll talk about that in just a second when we talk about flood risks. So that's something you want to remember there. The big difference between flood zone A and AE in Tennessee is going to be a base flood elevation has been set. If one hasn't been set, you may have to get a flood insurance study report done. So now let's talk about flood risk in Tennessee. How is a flood risk or flood risk score different from a flood zone? Remember, a flood zone is going to be more of a regulatory standpoint here. You know, this is whether a mortgage company is going to require it because they're federally backed. You know, sometimes a flood map may take 10, 15 years to update in some situations, but a flood risk could change overnight. Like what happened in North Carolina and Tennessee, where a lot of things were washed away and now there's nothing stopping water from coming down that hill. That's how a flood risk changed. The exact same thing happened in Gatlinburg many years ago when that historic fire happened in the Smoky Mountains. What happened is you lost all the vegetation, like you can see right here up behind me. Guess what happens when you lose the vegetation? The water no longer naturally goes into the soil. It starts running down, causing runoff. And this causes a lot of areas to become flood prone that weren't before. So this is why flood risk scores are constantly changed. Land development. As you add a lot of asphalt and cement in areas, the water's got to have somewhere to run. This can create higher flood risks. Weather patterns, climate change, all these different things that are changing are having an impact on flood risks. And this is how flood risk is different from flood zones. Now, in Tennessee, there's a few different resources you have to flood risk assessments. You can use companies like riskfactor.com. We've even built a tool on the floodinsuranceguru.com website that tells you what your actual flood risk score is. These are the chances of your property flooding over a 30-year period. How close to water are you? A lot of different factors. And you can click in the description of this video to get that. So those are flood risk assessment tools that you can use for your Tennessee home. So now we've talked about flood risks and the difference of flood zones. So now that you understand flood risks and flood zones, let's talk about flood insurance options in Tennessee. What are the options? So in Tennessee, you basically have two different options. You've got the National Flood Insurance Program and you've got private flood insurance. And it's important to understand no matter where you go in Tennessee, pricing through the National Flood Insurance Program should all be the same unless you're going through a special process called a policy assumption. And this is where maybe you're buying someone else's property and they've got a National Flood Insurance Program policy and then they decide to sign that policy over to you. This is called a policy assumption. Look, this can be very beneficial. I did it on my own property more than a decade ago and it gave the buyer of my property a $350 rate instead of a $3,000 rate. So if someone has an older FEMA policy, this can be very beneficial because you're not getting hit with all that rate at one time. It's happening slowly over a period of time. So this can be the benefits of doing a policy assumption with the National Flood Insurance Program when it's available. But when we're talking about the National Flood Insurance Program and pricing, look, whether you decide to go through an agent or a write your own carrier like a Right Flood, an Allstate, someone who basically is acting as a third party with the National Flood Insurance Program, or whether you decide to go directly to the National Flood Insurance Program through their direct program, then pricing should be the same. Now, FEMA also has a special program called NFIP Direct. This program is when you're going directly through FEMA. Look, flood insurance in Tennessee is going to be offered through all these different resources with the National Flood Insurance Program as long as your community participates in that program. Now, there are some exceptions where these write-your-own companies do not offer coverage if it's what's called a severe repetitive loss property. This is typically a property that's had 3 losses or more within a 10-year period. Then you do have to go through a special program. And typically, you'll have to have an agent that's directly appointed with the National Flood Insurance Program. Typically, this is how State Farm does all of their appointments, where they're directly appointed through the National Flood Insurance Program. So if you're working with a State Farm agent in Tennessee, this might be a benefit for you that they've already got that access there. So that's important to remember with the National Flood Insurance Program. Now let's talk a little bit about private flood insurance. Unlike the National Flood Insurance Program, private pricing is going to be different based on each company. You know, they're looking at things differently. And we'll get into risk factors in just a second. But these are your two options. So if you are a homeowner or a property owner in Tennessee and you're looking at flood insurance, you want to, when you're picking the right flood insurance agent, you want to work with someone that has access to the National Flood Insurance Program, probably NFIP Direct, someone who's got access to multiple private companies, someone who understands local risk right here, whether it be the Cumberland River, the Tennessee River, you know, the Saudi Daisy area, whether you're in the area near Chattanooga or is it Knoxville or Nashville, these are areas that have a history of flooding. You want to work with an agent that understands these options, but they understand the history of flooding locally, mitigation and different laws, because you want to make sure you're following these laws so that you don't have surprises. Now, when we're talking about pricing, let's talk about the National Flood Insurance Program and private. And the first thing to understand is that flood zones have a minimum impact on your Tennessee flood insurance now. In fact, the National Flood Insurance Program no longer uses flood zones in their rates at all. Private companies still use them some. So if they're not using flood zones in Tennessee, what exactly are they using? Well, they're using a lot of different factors. One of them being distance to water. Another one being, hey, what type of flooding? Is it river flooding? Is it lake flooding? Is it, coastal flooding? Of course, we don't have to worry about coastal flooding in Tennessee. And if we do, well, we got a bigger problem happening. But they're really looking at things like river flooding, lake flooding, flash flooding. They're looking at the frequency of it. They're looking at the replacement cost of your property. This means the actual cost to replace your building if it was to be destroyed. That has an impact on your rates. Because let's just say you've got 2 properties sitting next to each other with the National Flood Insurance Program. One has a replacement cost of $250,000. One has a replacement cost of $500,000. The one with the replacement cost of $500,000 is going to have a higher rate because replacement costs play such a big role in the flood insurance pricing with the National Flood Insurance Program now. Flood loss history could play a big role as well if you've had more than 2 claims since 2021 with the National Flood Insurance Program. Elevation of your home. The higher your home is elevated, the bigger the impact could be on your flood insurance premiums. Now let's talk about private flood insurance a little bit. Look, private flood insurance uses a lot of these same things. However, some of them still use flood zones zones in Tennessee, they also use their own internal flood risk score. Now, the one we built on our website can kind of give you an idea. If you've got a high score there, you potentially could see higher premiums on the private side. So that could be a good indicator for you, but it could also help you understand long term, hey, what's going to happen to my rates? Are my rates going to go up in Tennessee? Wouldn't it be nice to know that your rate's going to go from $400 to $4,000? Well, the good news is with the National Flood Insurance Program, that's typically not going to happen because they have a statutory rate increase of 18%. But private companies completely do this because they're surplus and not admitted normally, which means they follow different laws. It typically means you may have a policy through a company like Lloyd's of London, who is what's called the reinsurance, which is a group of companies that have come together to make sure that claim gets paid. We see it every day with private companies where you may get a $1,000 rate this year and $4,000 next year. In fact, we've seen this happen in the Chattanooga area after flooding a couple years ago, where a carrier went from $350 a year to $10,000 a year because they lost their reinsurance contract. So these are things that could happen with private flood insurance. So we've talked about pricing and we talked about flood zones and all that stuff between these two options. Now let's talk about coverages. The National Flood Insurance Program offers building coverage up to $250,000 on residential properties and $100,000 on personal contents. Now, currently here in 2024, they do not offer replacement costs on content. So those are the two main coverages available through the National Flood Insurance Program. Private flood insurance also offers building coverage and contents coverage and a third coverage called additional living expense. Now, it's important to understand, private will offer more coverage typically than that $250,000. I don't know about you, but replacing a house for $250,000 in 2024, it's become pretty challenging with replacement costs, inflation, and everything else. So you want to make sure you have the coverages you need there. So that's when it comes to coverages. Now, with private, they can offer replacement costs on contents. Imagine this. Imagine you bought a TV 10 years ago and you get a check from the federal government for what it costs to replace that thing 10 years ago. That's pretty disappointing. Imagine if you get a check from a private company on actually what it would cost to replace it today. How nice would that be? Now let's talk about this additional living expenses, which is that third coverage there that is offered through private companies but not the federal government. Imagine your house here on the lake flood and you need a temporary place to live while it's being repaired. Well, this is exactly where additional living expenses would kick into place. And this is exactly what we had happen with one of our customers on the lake several years ago, that her house flooded and she had a private policy when her neighbors had federal policy. She had the additional living expenses. Now, she had a separate deductible because remember, on flood, each coverage is going to have its own deductible and sometimes its own wait period. But she had a hotel paid for up to 6 months while her house was being repaired. The financial and the emotional stress that took off of her was huge. So this is exactly the type of situation that additional living expense can be applied in and help you better protect yourself and your family. So those are coverages. But what happens if you want to take out a National Flood Insurance Program policy, but you really need more? Well, then this is what we would call an excess flood insurance coverage, or an excess flood insurance policy in Tennessee. And what it does is your max coverage has to be available through the National Flood Insurance Program of up to $250,000. And then your excess policy would cover any difference there. So if you needed coverage up to $600,000, it would cover that difference there of that $350,000 for you. You would have typically different deductibles here. The coverage has to be maxed out with the National Flood Insurance Program before that policy kicks in. It's typically a private policy as well. So this could be two different claims for you. But this is how you could combine these two together to get the right coverages. Or you could just decide to take out one private policy that does all this for you. But sometimes private companies will not offer the traditional coverages that people need in some situations to do this. So that's your flood insurance options on the National Flood Insurance Program and private flood insurance. And we've talked about flood insurance coverages here as well. Now let's talk about how much flood insurance coverage do you need in Tennessee? It's a question we get asked every day by customers. So when it comes to flood insurance in Tennessee, there's two things you want to understand, and that is replacement cost and actual cash value. Remember, actual cash value, some federal policies are done on this, means depreciation is going to be taken out to a certain level. Replacement cost means that you're going to get the cost of actually replacing that building if you insure it right. Remember, typically private companies and even the federal government usually has an 80% rule where you've got to either insure for the max coverage available with federal, which is $250,000 on residential properties, or 80% of the replacement cost. Some private companies are 80 or 90%. So you want to remember this when you're selecting your private flood insurance policy with that flood insurance agent in Tennessee, because that's going to help you make sure that come claims time, you have the coverage you need. Now, what if you're just taking out that $250,000 with the National Flood Insurance Program? Even though the replacement cost is $500,000, you're still going to pay more because they're using replacement cost in the rates. Are they giving you more coverage? No, not at all. This is just how they're determining the rates now. So it's important for you that you understand that when it comes to understanding the National Flood Insurance Program and private and picking the right coverages here. Remember, each coverage is going to have its own deductible. So if you pick a $5,000 deductible and you've got 3 coverages with a private company, then you may have $15,000 in deductibles. Now, we've gotten through the flood insurance coverages. We've talked about flood risk and flood zones and your flood insurance options. And we've talked about, hey, how much coverage do you need? Let's talk a little bit now about, is flood insurance going to be mandatory in Tennessee? And we've got to go back to what we talked about earlier in this video. There's really 2 things here to determine this. Additional interest on a property and your flood zone. So remember, if you have a mortgage in Tennessee and you're in that special flood hazard area, which is typically going to be flood zone A or AE, it's going to be required. Now, one of the other questions we get asked in Tennessee is, can I change my flood zone in Tennessee? You absolutely can through a process we talked about earlier in this video called Letter of Map Amendment. Typically, your property, the lowest adjacent grade of your property, has to be above your base flood elevation. If you want to take a look at seeing if you qualify for a flood zone change, look, we'd be happy to take a look at that for you. We help people with that every day here at the Flood Insurance Guru. You can click in the description of this video to see if you possibly qualify for a flood zone change. Now let's talk about elevation certificates in Tennessee. Look, these are questions we get asked a lot, and that is, are elevation certificates required for flood insurance in Tennessee? Since Risk Rating 2.0 came out with the federal government in 2021, elevation certificates generally are no longer required for your federal policy, and they're no longer required for most private policies. In some situations, they still are. But with an elevation certificate, what are going to be some of the benefits of that in Tennessee? Like we talked about, flood zone changes. This is where an elevation certificate come in and can help you. An elevation certificate can actually show your house is elevated more than what FEMA's data or a private company's data showed you. This means that your rates may go down by providing the elevation certificate. And you can click on the corner of this video right here to watch our full video we've done on everything you need to know about elevation certificates. Now, we've covered a lot of different topics today, and I hope as a Tennessee homeowner, it's brought you value, and I hope that it's helped you figure things out. And maybe as a Tennessee homeowner, you're already ready to get a flood insurance quote, or you just want to download the guide to Tennessee flood insurance to help you navigate through this process. In the description of this video, you can do that. Go ahead and download that guide or get that quote. 3 simple steps. Step 1, fill out the form on our website. Step 2, review your proposal. And step 3, finalize your policy. It's that easy to protect in your Tennessee home. I'm Chris, the Flood Insurance Guru, and I want to say thank you for watching today's video on Tennessee flood insurance and what you need to know as a homeowner.